speaker view. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope that everybody enjoyed a break after our first panel discussion of the conference. So for those of you who are just joining us or watching live on YouTube, my name is Jack Williams, and I'm the president of the Institute for Global Negotiation. And this is taking part as the keynote speaker as part of our Negotiating Complexity Lessons from Food Security conference, which is a part of an annual series we do looking at the dynamics of global cooperation. And I'll pass over to Francis Cheneval, who's the chair of political philosophy at the University of Zurich, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Yes, I'm Francis Cheneval. I'm also on the board of the Institute, and I have the pleasure and honor also to host events of the Institute here at the University of Zurich from time to time. This is now an online conference, but sometimes there are events with presence. And it's a really great pleasure and honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Richard Wilcox, who is, of course, a very important and very experienced diplomat. He has been a diplomat for the United Nations and for the African Union, and he has been in very, very important functions in all of those institutions, especially including the African risk capacity to ensure African governments against natural disasters, and was also a person key to propose a levy on personal data extraction for financial aid to eliminate extreme poverty. Also in 2008, Richard Wilcox served as the UN Secretary General's envoy to Serbia for Kosovo independence process, where he also negotiated the SG Kosovo package, and then the first agreement in the UN Security Council on Kosovo in a decade. He also had previously served in UN political peacekeeping missions in Yugoslavia, Iraq, as well as Director of United Nations Affairs on the US National Security Council, 1999 to 2001. Dr. Wilcox holds a PhD from MIT. He was also a fellow at Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. He has also taught at the very prestigious Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He has been, in 2019, established the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Cyber Conflict Mediation Practice in Geneva. So this is another very important position and initiative that Richard Wilcox has had and taken, and it is, I think, in this function that he speaks to us today in his keynote address here, where he's going to, I think, outline how in the Ukraine war it was possible to have mediation and to secure an agreement that helped mitigate the global food crisis. So, Richard Wilcox, welcome to this conference, and thank you very much for having accepted to be our keynote speaker. And please take the floor.
Francis, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview. You make me feel very old as I sort of listen to you speaking, and I probably look even older right now, but that's simply because the last 2 weeks in the pursuit of these negotiations, went to Moscow and then to Kiev and then to Munich Security Conference, and especially going to Kiev, and is a very sort of engaged trip. You have to sort of fly to a nearby airport and take a car into the country, then take a train up to Kiev, and then it's an overnight train. You have to do the whole thing back out again. But I will be as vivacious as I can going through this, and then perhaps I'll speak for about half an hour or so, and then have time for questions to see what the direction you would like to take this in. And Jack just said that your previous speaker left you with the conclusion that you can't negotiate peace on an empty stomach. Well, let me start with the assertion then. There is, in fact, a high-level global consensus that people shouldn't starve, right? That may sound somewhat callous, but there isn't much of a consensus on a whole lot of other things, right? But that one really does exist, and that's an important part of this story. I'll take you through in a bit of a narrative way, and then close with some reflections on complexity. And I should just preface this, since we're also live streaming. I'll be more detailed about the engagement through the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. That is the things that happen sort of in the first part of this exercise. And I'll have to be a little bit more guarded regarding the activities of the United Nations. I'm currently the head of the UN task force pursuant to the Memorandum of Understanding between the United Nations and the Russian Federation, which is sort of the Russian counterpart to the Black Sea ships agreement, where the ships go in and out of the ports. So I have to be slightly more careful with that, but I think there's lots of interesting we can still cover. So in the spring of this year, I had taken time off from the United Nations to do something which I haven't actually added to my CV yet. But we started a company arising out of the HD engagement on digital issues to provide social media monitoring services, AI-enabled social media monitoring services in electoral contexts. And that was Kenya. We did last year, and now we're supporting the National Electoral Commission of Nigeria in the current election, and that'll be relevant in just a second why that's important in this story. So when the Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred in just about a year ago now, my colleagues and I at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as sort of the mediators, this is perhaps the biggest thing that has happened in quite some time. Is there space for us to engage on this issue? And at the local level, our colleague who handles the Eastern European file, the American colleague named David Gorman, on February 26th, when most people, including internationals, were heading in the opposite direction, took a train back to Kiev to be there and facilitate what could be done on the ground. And that was a very important step. Be with the locals. That stood us, the whole rest of the team, in good stead going forward, because while other organizations were evacuating their staff, David decided to go there to offer his help, and that created a credibility and also some key insights that were important going forward. But the rest of us, frankly, thought, yes, maybe David can help with some local issues on the front line, and as things develop. But on the whole, this is not going to be a conflict in which a tiny Swiss NGO based out of Geneva, no matter how self-important we pretend we are, and the great image we project forward as the largest and best established private mediation outfit. This is not going to be a conflict in which an NGO is going to play any role. This is going to be played at a very high level amongst very powerful countries at a very quick pace, that was just no room for initiatives or proposals or any assistance that an organization such as ours can provide. And that sort of remained the view going into the first couple of weeks into the war. As the war turned out quite different from what many people had expected, and sort of settled into a bit of not quite a stalemate, but a much slower process. Beginning in March, we started talking to particularly Ukrainian colleagues on different ideas that they were interested in terms of negotiations that were taking place then, and only then, that have not sort of continued since. But as you may recall, right early on in the war, there were in fact talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Brest, in Belarus. That's the famous Brest-Litovsk of the Russian surrender, essentially, in World War I. But those didn't, and it's just involving various concepts of neutrality and other possible solutions that were being explored at the time. and I wrote an article in Politico describing the Austrian precedent as around the middle of March. And then set that aside, went to Kenya to work on the elections monitoring. And in Kenya, in Nairobi at the time, this war was front and center, not because of any particular concern about the white man's conflict far away that doesn't really sort of pertain to Africa, but because of food prices. Prices for food had shot up, in particular for wheat being imported into the country by almost 30% over already very high level. That was becoming a campaign issue in Kenya. In Mombasa port, ships carrying tea that were destined for Russia couldn't leave because the sanction situation was unclear how payments could be done, and carriers were very reluctant to take that. So that those were stuck there, adding further concern to the Kenyan economy. So I got back in touch with my colleagues after some conversations there and said, look, I understand at the political level there's no space for us, probably, and frankly, there's no space for United Nations Secretary General either, really, because you have a permanent member of the Security Council, and that role is clear to you all how critically that influences on the situation. So the Secretary General can perhaps offer to mediate, but in the end, it's a very imbalanced situation given the construct of the United Nations. But perhaps there is an area in which some form of mediation is possible, and that is food security. This war has had a massive immediate impact on food prices, and in parentheses fertilizer prices, and we'll get to that, why that's important going forward. And there is food security is an issue on which you can engage when you can't engage on other political issues, right? There is a consensus that people just shouldn't be starving, and the impact of this war was very immediate and very clear, and very clearly observable in the fact that there was a blockade of the Ukrainian ports, so they just couldn't export all these bulk commodities that would normally be going to various countries, including countries in Africa. And just how much of that goes to countries in Africa again became an issue further down the line. At the same time, there are these issues with Russia, right? The trade part. There was a market decrease in Russian exports very early on in the conflict, as traders felt unsure what the sanctions meant and how to interpret those. So there was also a decrease of Russian imports. So we felt that there might be something there that could be that would be worth exploring. We also were cognizant that whereas we can engage in Kiev, to engage in Moscow, somebody else needs to do that. The Russians don't do NGOs, right? As political interlocutors. So we said, well, let's engage our UN friends in New York and then make this proposal. We put a paper in circulation at the time that's since been leaked. It's in this DevEx article that one of the experienced UN reporters, Colin Lynch, wrote, and got some interest. There's a working group that deals with food security issues writ large. We participated in that, so we did all that, and then decided to go on a visit to Kiev in early April to assess the situation. And there it turned out that this was actually even more interesting than we had thought, which was that because of the very large harvest the previous year, all the storage facilities in Ukraine were still full of grains. The next harvest, despite the front line and the war, was going to be a very sizable one. So far from the first reaction that traders had, that essentially you can write off anything coming out of Ukraine, you can write off everything kind of Russia, prices shoot up. No, there's a very substantial harvest, still from last year in Ukraine, and a very substantial harvest coming in this year in Ukraine, that somehow that could, if it got to the world markets, would have a major price impact. And we discussed that with traders and others, and became very clear that that in fact was the case. Based on this visit, we then went back to the Secretary General and others to propose a way forward on engaging with both Russia and Ukraine, and others were pursuing that similar line of reasoning. The International Chamber of Commerce in early April had spoken about possibility of a blue corridor to take out commodities from Ukraine, not engaging on the Russia piece. And we put those forward. The Secretary General took it up and raised the issue in his meetings in Moscow and Kiev, which to that point were going to be about prisoners of war. And that was sort of this whole episode. You might remember there was a steel factory, Azovstal, in Mariupol, that the Secretary General was trying to facilitate a way of an exchange that would allow the Ukrainians to leave that besieged place. That turned out to be a very, very difficult proposition. But in both Moscow and Kiev, the support in principle for disengagement on food security was manifest. We also reached out to the African Union, where I had worked in the past as the head of the Director General of the African Union capacity, to say, look, your voice is going to be important in this, in the sense that as the higher food prices are a hugely regressive impact of this war, that'll hit African populations dependent on food imports, particularly in Egypt and other countries, quite hard. So your voice needs to be heard. The Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, took on this message, went to Moscow, and had this conversation about just how important it is that Russia engage in trying to find a solution, and was going to go to Kiev, but then that didn't work out because there's a lack of reciprocity, as it was understood that then Zelensky wanted to address the African Union. The African Union wasn't quite ready for that. So there was a bit of tension in that remained over the next comings. But the voice of the developing world, in this case, particularly through the African Union, was a key one in this in constructing this this approach. So that was sort of the framing of the exercise, and then the Secretary General took it forward. To take it forward required the participation of other actors, particularly because it is the Black Sea, and there is the Bosporus and the straits that sort of connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Turkey was going to have a pivotal role to play in the exercise. Turkey plays a special role when it comes to any sort of shipping in the Black Sea, due to something called the Montreux Convention that gives it special rights about ships coming in and out. So there was an early engagement with Turkey to see what role they wanted to play. The UN, taking this bit forward, divided the responsibilities into two groups. One was the team under the humanitarian coordinator Martin Griffiths that worked the exports on the ports, primarily with Turkey as the main interlocutor here, and I'll get to that in great detail. And the second team was the one to deal with the Russian side of things, and that's a team led by the Secretary General of UNCTAD, who's myself as the lead negotiator for on that side. So that was the framing as an effort to mitigate the impact of the war on global food security, and then sort of the institutional setup of how the UN was going to engage on this. Now, on the side of the shipping, the Ukrainian grain exports, it was very clear that Turkey was going to play the lead role in this exercise. Turkey maintained very productive relations with both sides in this conflict, supplying weapons to Ukraine, other support to Ukraine, but also maintaining trading relationship with Russia. So much of the early negotiations were in fact facilitated by Turkey with the parties, with the United Nations in a supporting role. On the side of the Russians, the first insistence of Russia was that discussions on the facilitation of their trade had to precede any engagement on a Ukrainian corridor. And we agreed to that, and these discussions preceded the Ukrainian corridor discussions by 2 days. And it was, but we had to construct it in a different way. It didn't seem feasible to us to have any direct conversations between the European Union and the United States, the UK as sort of the key sanctioning countries, and the Russian Federation at that stage, but that we would have conversations with all sides. We then entered into an agreement with the Russian Federation that was then signed contemporaneously with the Black Sea Grain Initiative agreement in Istanbul, that we would facilitate the unimpeded export of Russian food and fertilizer to international markets, including payments, insurance, and all those and other things that were affected by, impacted by various restrictive measures. So that was a very indirect setup, and it has remained so. Whereas on the actual grain export side from Ukraine, as it's a more familiar part of the story, the UN facilitated the establishment in Istanbul of this joint coordination center where Russian naval officers, Ukrainian naval officers, experts, and naval officers, and through and company ships taking out grain from grain. And that has continued to function. It's worth for a moment, as the war, annexations, the attacks on infrastructure, Ukrainian counteroffensive, all throughout, in Istanbul, there's Russian naval officers, Ukrainian naval officers, and Turkish naval officers, plus some UN colleagues, sitting together to facilitate this flow of resources from the Ukrainian Black Sea ports to the rest of the world. And our work was done we would consult with the European Union, consult with the UK, the US, and then clarify the intention of not having sanctions impact global food security in various forms. And that also continues throughout. Now, it's a complicated setup and requires and there's complexity on all sides. The issues cut across. There is issues that relate to agriculture in Ukraine, that relate to markets in Ukraine, that relate to shipping in Ukraine, which are in different ministries. They relate to security issues, mining of ports, other defensive measures, especially in coastal areas, and that relate to very technical shipping and inspections of shipping issues, and international maritime law and inspections of ships and all that, which brings in a host of actors on that side. And on the Russian side, it is of course the government, it's Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Trade, and Russian business tends to be quite concentrated, and especially in the relevant to us, which was primarily, as it turned out, fertilizer exports. Russia is a very important provider of global fertilizers, and that's like 4 to 5 companies that are largely owned by 4 to 5 individuals who are all listed as sanctioned individuals, even if the companies are exempt because of their the type of commodity and its importance for global food security. So negotiating those arrangements is quite a complicated exercise, and then it kind of has to all fit together, right? And this is something that, if you follow this over the summer and in the fall, constant complaints. So the food coming out of Ukraine is mostly fodder destined to European countries and China rather than life-saving food. And our position from the beginning was, this is a trade issue. It's not the destination of the individual ships that matters, but it's the fact that Ukraine is reconnected to international markets, and that helps bring prices down. Likewise, it's the fact that Russia is connected to international markets that helps bring prices down. And if European countries weren't importing maize from Ukraine to feed as animal fodder, they'd be importing maize from elsewhere as animal fodder. So that trade displacement effect has an impact on developing countries, even if the individual ships go elsewhere. Likewise, and much on the fertilizer side, the European Union blocked any imports of Russian fertilizer, and in fact, there was the thought at the time was that argument made that, look, if the European Union isn't importing Russian fertilizer, that means more Russian fertilizer is available for developing countries to buy, right? Now, those of you who've taken economics 101 will realize that doesn't work that way, right? It's not that the European Union just stopped importing Russian fertilizer and just stopped using fertilizer. No, they started buying fertilizer from elsewhere, right? So in those markets where the developing countries used to buy their fertilizer, now European purchasers are showing up with deep pockets to buy that fertilizer, hence bidding up the prices there, while the developing countries would have to figure out how to get access to the to fertilizer from Russia, where they may not have commercial relationships that are well established, and where there's sort of a whole host of concerning issues regarding banks not being willing to do the transactions, insurers and shipping not willing to engage with Russia. So it's actually trade displacement is as important in terms of global food security in this context as the actual level of supply. Because it is just supply and demand, yes, will eventually equal out. But while that happens, especially when there's restrictions on various channels, there's a lot of pain and higher prices that are imposed on, particularly on vulnerable populations, as that works its way through. Additional complexities to be understood, and an economic issue that was clearly not well understood when the sanctions were put in place. And certainly something that only became apparent to us as we went through this exercise. As you know, this is the agreement on the Black Sea is 120 days at a time, and we're coming up against a deadline in the middle of March, hence the intensity of the talks in Moscow and Kiev. There's been alternatives suggested to this and alternatives established, particularly what the European Union calls the solidarity lanes, that is overland transport from Ukraine in order to be able to reduce the dependence on the Black Sea ports. That's now about 2/3 of the exports are running through those lanes, and that's a great effort. But if you ever study any logistics, ocean shipping is unbeatable when it comes to cost. Shipping on trains costs multiples of what it costs to put particularly bulk commodities on big ships. So the Ukrainian farmers are telling us, look, through these solidarity lanes, we just can't make a profit. Yes, we can export, but to make a profit, we have to be able to get stuff on ships. Otherwise, the costs are too high, and the international market prices don't allow us to capture the profit. And we need certainty. Ukraine is approaching in March into April its spring planting, and the farmers clearly say, we've struggled through last year. We still have what it takes to buy the seeds, the fuel, and the labor to plant for the season, for the spring planting. The fall planting already happened, but without certainty that we can export, and that we can export in June, July, August, we can't take the risk of planting, because we will have expended our resources and will not be able to export our harvest. So we need a clear solution that gives us confidence to plant. Otherwise, we can't invest. On the other hand, in the fertilizer shortage, especially that of ammonia. Ammonia is a natural gas product that I'd never heard of before I got engaged on this thing. And it turns out Russia is a very major exporter of ammonia. It's about 20% of the world supply comes from Russia. There's only 2 corridors through which Russia exports ammonia to the world markets. And that is through Latvia and through Ukraine. It's a big old Soviet era pipeline that transports it all the way through Ukraine to the port of Odessa, the same port that the grain shipments go out. In the absence of those corridors being open, ammonia prices have stayed stubbornly high, even when the prices of finished fertilizers have come down a good bit. And what that means is underproduction and loss of yields in growing countries. And when you try to replace a loss of yields through imported food, it's a very, very expensive proposition. You've had the World Food Program colleague earlier, just to give you a sense of the numbers involved. Just to get the ocean shipment to big African ports is not a problem. It's the overland cost that's expensive. If you have the least expensive for food or fertilizer, it's like Gambia, $60 a ton to get it in. For a commodity that costs, like in case of wheat, $300 a ton, or in terms of fertilizer, $1,000, that's doable. South Sudan, $600 a ton to get it from Mombasa to South Sudan, right? That's twice the cost of the actual commodity when it comes to food. It's a very significant fraction when it comes to fertilizer. So trying to compensate for local production losses due to the absence of fertilizer through additional food deliveries is a completely losing proposition. And that is one of the key drivers that motivate us. I mean, we want to contribute, of course, to any form of a solution, the search for peace in the Ukraine war. But first and foremost, our objective is to mitigate the impact on global food security of this conflict. Good. That was my narrative, and I think I've made it to exactly half an hour. And I'm very happy to discuss any questions you have or elaborate further on any part of this exercise.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. So fascinating overview there of how the deal came about, and also how the deal came about and how it's looking as well. Maybe I could start with a question. And I just wanted to pick up on, you said there at the end that you didn't know too much about ammonia. I'm not sure if that was you being modest before, and that led me to the question, to what extent there seems to be a lot of technical issues going on with this deal in terms of all of these interconnected issues, trade, economics. How did you approach that? Is there a very steep learning curve, and to what extent could you involve experts in supporting you with that? And to what extent were there more generalists involved who are more familiar with negotiation, mediation kind of aspects?
Yes. I think I'm a generalist. I cover a good bit of space with some particular niches. I mean, but I studied political economy, political philosophy, and strategic issues. Actually, I thought it was going to become an issue on nuclear targeting and nuclear issues, which then went out of style until very recently. But we drew heavily on expertise, but experts cannot help you in a negotiation, right? Experts can talk to other experts, and that will lead you absolutely nowhere, because the negotiation is an art form in and of itself, and in understanding you as part of as being a negotiator, you just have to be able to deep dive into very complex technical topics and be able to talk about those yourself, being informed by experts, but you can't have experts replace you at the table. And when I set up the African risk capacity, I had to sort of learn the insurance trade, right? And I mean, I enjoy these things, right? I love diving into detail. That's fun, but it can be intellectually exhausting. And then all of a sudden, we thought we had only looked at grains until we started dealing with the Russians, and the fertilizer issue came on the table, right? And it turns out there's three main ingredients in fertilizers. There's ammonia, phosphate, and oh God, what's the third? Phosphate, ammonia, and I've forgotten it already. I talk about this every day. I should know this. It'll come back to me. But they come from different parts of the world, right? Oh, potash, which comes mainly from Belarus and Russia, and Belarus of all places. So you get another complication. Potash in Africa, which you would need for blending for fertilizer, comes from Morocco, and about half of that comes from Western Sahara, which is yet another issue, right? That when you try to sort of put this stuff together, countries require very different soil qualities, require different blends between those three main ingredients. None of this I had ever heard of before until June, and then it was a steep learning curve. Likewise, on the insurance side, I was quite steady. We had to deal with the Joint War Committee at Lloyd's that sort of designates which areas are covered by war risk, and then that in fact impacts the prices and whatnot. And Russians argue from their perspective that why is all of Russia seen as a war risk, right? When we only have this war on one of our borders, right? So, the whole country is at war, right? The way that the insurers look at it. Actually, the insurers refer to the three countries, the whole area as the rub countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, which offends all of the participants by sort of being thrown into one box together. But from their perspectives as insurers, they say, look, whatever the political guidance is not an issue. We need to look at risk, and the risk of losing ships not to mines is as great as the risk of losing ships to confiscation, right? Or other concerns. Then on the payment side, the global payment structure is technically complex, but boils down to one system called SWIFT. And while the European Union does not impose sanctions that have an extraterritorial quality, unlike the United States, which does this, it just so happens that SWIFT is a company in Belgium, right? So falls under the laws of Belgium, which falls under the regulations of the European Union, and hence is very much affected by restrictions on its system. And in the financial international payments world, to SWIFT to be SWIFT or DSWIFT is like Google. It's a verb, right? It is if you're not on SWIFT, you just can't do financial transactions. And everybody in this forum here today, and all of your friends, everybody has a SWIFT number, at least one. Sort of it's become part of our common DNA. So yes, you have to dive into these issues and be able to command them in conversation with others who are also learning these issues, and then bring in their own experts to try to negotiate with you. So it's the quick absorption of information is a key part of negotiation. So that's a rather lengthy response.
No, I think it's very interesting, and I think that it's sometimes I think negotiators. I mean, it's certainly, I think, a skill that they have that quick absorption of information, and also that they are able to understand that they might not necessarily be negotiating with experts themselves. So that there is this, that the issues are kind of distilled in a way to the basics. So there is a comment on this in the chat from Marwan, who says that humanitarian negotiation policies, that being an expert gives the negotiator more legitimacy while engaging with a non-expert counterpart. Is that something? Yeah. Is that something which played a role here, or has played a role when you've been engaging with non-expert counterparts, falling back upon experts to kind of inform that negotiation?
in some, when it came to say the maritime, the basis for inspections, for example, right? For inspecting ships that belong to big companies, you have to have some sort of a legal basis. You can't just sort of conjure thin air. So the first thought is, well, Security Council decision creates a basis in international law. That's what we did in the Kosovo context, right? In this case, getting to a Security Council decision was going to be prohibitively complex. So the next thought was, and I suggest this is, well, there is the Montreux Convention, which allows for the inspections of military ships by Turkey. And in fact, but these would be inspections looking for weapons rather than inspections of actual naval vessels, military vessels. But then, well, if you suspect a vessel of carrying ships carrying weapons, does that count as a naval vessel that is subject to inspections? And here, being able to draw on the International Maritime Organization's, it's such an obscure area of international law. Was quite critical, and they said Montreux Convention doesn't. No, that's a gray zone. We don't want to set precedents here with this. Don't go there. But there's safety protocols, security and safety protocols that have the standing under international law that allow for states at high levels of risk to conduct inspections, which can serve as the basis of this exercise. That's not something that even sort of chatbot would have given you, or a casual Wikipedia search. You do need to have real deep experts that can also then have the sense of, maybe this is a gray zone about searching vessels for weapons, but we as the International Maritime Organization, lawyers in this field, do not want that to go in that direction. But there is something else. And having those lawyers at the table then with you, that does make a big difference. But you'll be having those conversations not just across the table, but in any number of formats. So being able to command those issues is an irreplaceable asset for the negotiator.
Great, wonderful. So if you, I'm happy to read out. I'll read out the questions which are coming in on the chat. But if you want to raise your hand and ask them yourself, you can certainly go ahead as well. Ivan, yeah, would you like to read out your question? I was going to come to yours, so go ahead. Oh, no, we can't hear you.
I know. So
it's a matter of having too many screens. Thanks for a wonderful talk, Richard. I had a question for you regarding exactly this physical displacement, right? Like in Putin's sort of approach in his internal communication to my countrymen, he's using this argument that, oh, we've agreed that those ships are meant to relieve the poverty in those regions, right? That in African countries in particular, and in poor of the world, and he's using it as sort of, oh, again, the global West has tricked us, or again, we cannot trust them anymore. Do you see that as a danger to that deal overall? And is it something that you didn't think about in advance? And it should sort of, is it an externality of that decision?
Yeah, it is an externality of the decision, I would say. In the very first notes on this, we were very clear. The target of this exercise is world market price, right? It is not destination of individual ships. This is a global trade issue. Now, once the public mobilization, especially in the West, for this effort got going, it took on much more of these are humanitarian shipments. And humanitarian shipments means shipments that go from producing country to vulnerable populations directly, right? Whereas the argument about the target is the price, which was very clearly there at the beginning, got a bit lost in this in this exercise. And we knew going into this, over half of Ukraine's exports in any normal year is animal fodder, right? Animal fodder for food security is hugely important, by the way. That is, for one, if it isn't that the other parts are displaced, then of course, it's important for markets to function, because that demand is is there, but it became a distraction in the exercise. And I think that was probably also a mistake made on our side to even get into this dialogue in terms of trying to count how many ships go to Somalia and Yemen as opposed to ships going to elsewhere. No, it was from the beginning, it was about prices and facilitating trade. It's a very clear indicator, namely that the world market prices would come down.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. So I'll read another question from the chat. So that's from Marwan as well. He says, what are the arguments used by the negotiation team with the Russian side, technical or political? So quite a broad question. Marwan, would you like to elaborate a little?
Yeah, I mean that with the Russian side, I mean, as the team is, you know, the political side of the United Nations. No, I mean, I was assuming that they may use political arguments to convince them to release this. But then later, he also mentioned some technical side for the negotiations, as I think part of the Russian side was agriculture minister. So they also were assuming to discuss the technical aspect of the issue more than the political aspect. That, yeah. I mean, I heard that I understood the answer with later when he was going deeply in the discussion.
Yeah, no, I think I can explain that. The two sides have their own interests in this, right? The Ukrainian side is pretty straightforward to understand, right? It gets commodities out, revenue in, keeps the farming sector alive. That's very easy, right? But what is it that keeps Russia interested in and keeps Russia in this deal? And there are three parts to that interest. Number one, and just the one that sort of underpins it even when everything else doesn't work, is the Russo-Turkish relationship. The country for Russia when it comes to its financial and other commercial access to internal markets, and that ship. And Turkey sees itself very much as sort of the guarantor of this deal. And technically, even it is a deal between Ukraine and Turkey, and on one side, and Russia and Turkey on another, with no common signature agreement between the two. And the Russo-Turkish relationship is the principal underpinning of this exercise. Most of the negotiations that led to the ports agreement were in fact mediated most exclusively by Turkey. So that's number one. That's a very political angle. The interest number two is the perceptions of Russia in developing countries. When it comes to the perceptions of Russia following the invasion and the war, in the West, that's pretty much a lost cause, right? I mean, thinking now from the Russian perspective. But in the developing world, that is a different story. We heard this throughout, and even still now at the Munich Security Conference, African, Latin American, this is not our war, right? And Russia has an interest in trying to sort of maintain its standing, if you will, in the developing world. It does not want to be seen as the country which causes great food security crisis. So that battle of perception is not lost for Russia, and they're willing to facilitate, make some concessions to Ukraine in order to maintain that. And then the third pillar is the technical work that is much of what we do, is facilitating the export of Russian food and especially fertilizers, which gets you into those very detailed technical arrangements. That's sort of the third interest in this. All three underpin Russia's engagement in this agreement, in these agreements.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me as a humanitarian worker. Work with MSF, which is a medical organization. Usually, the advice that we hear from high level since 10 years that please engage with your counterparts in technical aspects. Try to argue with the political side. So I'm really interested to hear this the political arguments that eventually give a positive feedback. So it's very interesting to hear that from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Max, you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much for your talk. Just on the last point that you raised, it's funny, I actually got sent a poll, one of my friends shared it today, about a poll given to lots of different countries about what their view of Russia was. And there's a lot to it, but whereas 65% of people in Great Britain see Russia as an adversary, in India, which is the most comfortable with Russia, it's 51% see it as an ally. So there's a kind of like, sort of, when you look at India and England, almost completely direct opposite in terms of how they're viewing this war and how they're even viewing the role of Russia as someone that's an ally that can help them or someone that is an adversary that can hurt them. So just kind of interesting on that last thing you said there. The question really was just more about concessions. I mean, you mentioned them a bit throughout, but I'd like if you could expand just a little bit more about concessions in these negotiations, kind of who's willing to give what and how much they're willing to give and why and how important they are. It seems that, well, there's a big imbalance in who can give anything, but yeah, how do you think they play a role in this?
Well, I mean, the most obvious concession, of course, is the partial lifting of the blockade of the ports, right? So until July 22nd, nothing was going in and out, right? And then a rather complex system was put in place where certain commodities, grains, essentially, oils meaning food oils, are allowed, and ships had to come out because there were ships already blocked in the port since February 24th. If they have to be inspected going out, and then they have to be inspected coming in. But that essentially is quite a significant Russian concession over the, and when I use the word concession, I get taken to task by others saying, well, of course they should do that. It's a moral obligation. But I mean, if we were talking in the world of sort of trading moral obligations, then we wouldn't have much to do. In this case, Russia very much sees this as a concession, and also because it generates revenue for Ukrainian economy and hence the Ukrainian state. And look, that is a concession when you just accept the fact that there is a war. The first big concession in the opposite direction was a thing called the General License 6C, which is in the United States Treasury is the sort of omnipotent institution that sanctions and can grant relief from sanctions, and that very clearly specified that foods and fertilizers are exempt in a way that companies in that space found it sufficiently reassuring to engage with Russia. Russian fertilizer exports to the United States are at normal levels, right? And that is a concession because yes, that generates revenue for Russian businesses, which then pay taxes to the state and whatnot, and contributes to that exercise. On the European side, it's much more difficult to make any concessions, and to be clear, we don't. Our agreement builds upon the notion, on the understanding that food and fertilizer should be exempt from restrictive measures because of its importance, their importance for global food security. For the European Union to do anything in that space requires a unanimous decision of the 27 member states in the Council of Europe. That's a very difficult proposition to arrive at. Whereas in the United States, it's an executive order of an executive department of government that can do this. So the ability of the European Union, should it want to make any concessions, is very much limited by the political architecture of the Union.
Wonderful. Okay, so I think we have another question from Vera.
Yes. So first of all, incredibly interesting. Thank you very much for your insights. I do have a bit of a naive question in that sense, very open. Do you see this agreement or these negotiations as a building block for a wider agreement? Do you think this could be the stepping stone for something bigger?
No, is the immediate answer. The reason this agreement worked is because you were able to isolate a particular issue from the larger politics of the conflict, which is massive, right? And while it is significant that you have, say, naval personnel sitting together, that did not have any impact when it came to the further conduct of the war since the agreement was put in place, and it's unlikely to have that going forward. It did not facilitate direct contact, say, between the parties. So if you look from the mediation literature as a confidence building measure, no, this doesn't amount to much, because it doesn't connect the relevant players that are engaged on a much broader and much more existential issues. This was an exclusion of one particular issue from the conflict that did not serve to build confidence between the parties in a way that could result in any sort of engagement on other issues, which would also be in entirely different channels, namely not through the United Nations, most likely, because of the way the United Nations architecture works, right? That's something that the parties would engage on directly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I think my chat is working. Sometimes the messages don't necessarily appear in the correct order. But as you were so punctual in keeping your presentation to half an hour, I think we owe it to you to be as punctual to keep this the Q&A to half an hour as well. I have to say thank you so much for taking the time, especially given your busy schedule and your active involvement in ensuring that these negotiations continue and this very valuable work is implemented. It's really been a pleasure to listen to you and to hear an insider's account of the negotiations which we see or we read about on the news. And it's reassuring to know that there are people working on these issues and that they are real people as well, which is always reassuring. So thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope that if we'll be able to continue the conversation and the interaction. And I know again from our previous panelist, he also said that rest and having some time away from these negotiations is important. So we hope that you'll be able to enjoy some time in that regard as well. But thank you very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to have you address us, and thank you again for this and also for the valuable work you're doing.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
So we'll end the conference day today, today's conference session, and we'll pick up again tomorrow. So we hope that some of you or all of you will be able to join us for panel 3 and panel 2 and panel 3, which is looking at EU policy with regards to sustainability and with regards to food security. And also panel 3 is then looking at the competing interests. So how food security can be in some way, has to react to sustainability, to security as well. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you to all of you who joined us, and we hope to see you tomorrow as well.
Thank you, Jack. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye. Goodbye.